Thanks, Andrea. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our ongoing Taking Aim series. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all and thank you for taking time to join us today. I see we are as far west as Hawaii, so aloha to all of you who are joining us from that far out. Thank you, because I'm sure it's wee hours. I think you might be 4 or 5 hours behind us. So appreciate that. I'd like to introduce two members of the core team at the NLN who have been involved in the discussions on these webinars, starting as far back as March when we were all thrust into this new world. Joining me are my colleagues, Dr. Marianne Rizzolo and Dr. Barbara Patterson. And I'd like to introduce now our moderator, main moderator for this session, and our two presenters. So our main moderator this morning is Dr. Beth Hallmark, and Dr. Hallmark is a faculty member at Belmont University School of Nursing in Nashville, Tennessee. And Beth has been involved with the NLN for many years now and is really a true wonderful colleague, and I'm very thrilled that she can assist in moderating this session today. Our two speakers are also dear colleagues who I teach with quite a bit, and they're just phenomenal faculty members who are at the front lines working with our learners, like many of you, on a day-to-day basis, and they're here to share their expertise. So let me tell you a little bit about them. Our first speaker, Dr. Michelle Moulton, is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Nursing in Baltimore. She's been teaching entry-level nursing students since 2010. And her interest specialty area is really in the area of healthcare simulation and debriefing. And she brings all of those experienced with her and works very closely with her learners in the classroom, primarily now, and in the clinical environments. Our second presenter is Dr. Rachel Onello, and Dr. Onello is an associate professor at the University of South Carolina College of Nursing in Columbia. She also has over 10 years of experience teaching in baccalaureate and entry-level master's programs, and she focuses on designing, implementing, and evaluating the classroom setting, the clinical setting, and some as well work in a simulation-based education. Both of these two are phenomenal in the work that they do, and I know you'll enjoy this session. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Beth Hallmark.
Thank you, Sue. I'm so excited that everyone's here. I wanted to tell you a little bit about this series. This is called the Taking Aim at Good Teaching series. It's sponsored by the NLN, and this is the first webinar in a 3-part series. The NLN approach has really been to focus on good teaching. Even in the midst of COVID, we still want to go back to that fundamental of good teaching. So it really boils down to that. Again, this is the first in a series of 3 webinars. The first one is related to cognitive learning, and the second is psychomotor, and the third is affective. And so we invite you at the end of the webinar to go to the website, and I think Andrea will put that link or direct you to that at the end of the webinar so that you can find those others that will be spread out through the rest of the semester. And so we're really excited. I'm so excited for you to hear this because this content is amazing. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Michelle and Rachel.
Oh, thank you so much, Sue and Beth and Andrea and the NLN team. It is such an honor to be here. I'm just always so grateful to be working with the NLN. And so I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Michelle Moulton, assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Nursing.
And I am Rachel Onello, an associate professor at the University of South Carolina College of Nursing. And I too want to express appreciation and gratitude, especially for everything that the NLN does to support educators and to recognize the science of education and the scholarship of education. So thank you.
And you know, Rachel and I wanted to start by just doing a little bit more, give a little bit more experience to help kind of focus and shape our lens for our conversation today. And Rachel and I both have taught in a wide variety of settings within nursing education, including classroom, clinical, simulation, lab. So today I'll start with myself. So today I'll be coming from my experience teaching in the classroom in the entry-level undergraduate program.
And my lens that I'm coming through today is entry-level graduate students, both in the classroom and in blended hybrid models online, synchronously and asynchronously. So we wanted to get into our conversation together by setting our webinar container, what you can expect in this dialogue over the next hour or so together. And when we think about using and talking about evidence-based brain science strategies to enhance cognitive outcomes, that is an ocean of a conversation. And so we want to frame this up as this is really just a drop in the pond today together. There's so much more that we could talk about and explore. We could talk about it for weeks, right, Michelle?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And we actually have. So Rachel and I talked about all types of topics in nursing education for about 10 weeks. So we could go on for 10 weeks. When we taught with the NLN faculty intensive course. And we taught anything from curriculum mapping to neuroscience and teaching strategies and evaluation. So soup to nuts.
Yes, so Sue, Michelle, and I have spent a lot of time talking, thinking, and applying about this. So we will not spend 10 weeks worth of content in our time together today. And so we wanted to just let you know the chat box is open. We have the moderator, Beth and Sue, are monitoring that. So don't hesitate to engage and interact through that chat box. And we'll have periods of time where we're going to check in and throw the conversation out to you as well.
And our aim today is to really encourage a growth mindset in not only our learners, but also us as teachers. And our hope today is that we can challenge and inspire you, our audience, to take some small piece of our conversation today and put it into your own practice in a way that feels good to you so that you can better connect and reach your learners.
And while we both love talking about brain science and evidence-based teaching strategies, we don't want to lose sight of the bigger picture, which is learning outcomes. That is what drives everything we do as educators, drives every single decision we make downstream. And so we're going to keep coming back to this idea throughout our conversation together of keeping our eye set on that target of learning outcomes, both at the larger programmatic level and how it drills down to the course level and the class level outcomes.
And you know, it's also important for Rachel and I to acknowledge an elephant in the room is that, you know, when we talk about teaching strategies that are supported by brain science, it really requires a dialogue. And it's part of our teaching philosophy that learning happens best when there's really a conversation between teacher and learner. And so when Rachel and I were putting our heads together to create this webinar, we really were very thoughtful about how can we, you know, really keep our philosophy and our importance of connecting with our audience and also kind of work within the boundaries of a webinar, which is oftentimes to sort of deliver information. So we came up with a way of Rachel and I will have a dialogue and really kind of role model and demonstrate how Rachel and I as colleagues really talk about how we use brain science in our classrooms and our different settings and really share some of our experience and stories and how we have reached learners over our time together.
Yeah, so it's really like a podcast. You're about to experience a virtual podcast, and Michelle and I share ideas about podcasts all the time, and we like to think about the really effective podcasts being the ones that bring you to the edge of your thinking, can get a little spicy. So we hope today we're going to come back to the science and the literature and the evidence that drives all of this, but hopefully stimulate a lot of maybe creative or interesting or challenging thoughts about how we use evidence-based teaching strategies to enhance outcomes. So we were talking and we thought, gosh, if this is a podcast, it needs an episode title, right, Michelle? Yes. And so we were thinking if we had to name this episode, it would be titled A Tale of Two Educators Teaching Within the Map.
I know. And what I love about this title is two things. One is that, you know, this tale of two educators is that Rachel and I were hoping to really impart our different perspectives, our different views and philosophies and approaches and styles and how we teach. Because we also believe that teaching really does come from, you know, while we're all kind of focused and teaching within a map and focused on our outcomes and we are in that shared space, we really come from different styles and perspectives, and that's how we reach our students best. So we wanted to make sure our title captured that.
Exactly. And our common ground is the curricular map that we all operate within that's unique to our own programs and our own institutions.
So what we wanted to do now is actually connect with our audience a little bit at the beginning of our talk and ask everyone to think about what are some of the struggles you're facing as a nurse educator, either what you're anticipating facing this semester, maybe some struggles or challenges you faced in the spring. So if you can put that, your contribution in the chat box, and Rachel, myself, and Beth will be taking a look at that chat box for a few minutes and just responding to some of the things that come in. Active learning. Students who don't respond. I know that's another, keeping students engaged. So that's really a big theme. Engaging students in the online environment. And I know a lot of people have taken a pivot to teaching online, or at least at the very least a hybrid. Yes. And I'm seeing here also about how students are really faced with a lot of challenges dealing with COVID. So I also know that students are dealing with a lot of new compliance and trying to navigate just getting to clinical, if they can go to clinical.
See the word engagement a lot, Michelle.
Yeah.
One that I thought was interesting is buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
Buy-in and dialogue are also how to dialogue.
I'm seeing here faculty burnout too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I'm glad you mentioned that, because what we'll talk about today, I think will speak to maybe why we're feeling some of that burnout because of all the moving pieces and all of the things that we're trying to manage.
I see competing priorities. I think that's important too. Students are overwhelmed, struggling with competing priorities, because I do think that there's so many things going on.
Yes. And then we've got here also, you know, how do we teach? We have our curriculum, and our curriculum involves clinical teaching, classroom teaching, skills lab teaching, but how do you teach skills over the computer? So we're meeting some of these challenges with the change in our environment and the context in which we're teaching, but the content is still staying the same. So that'll be interesting, Rachel. I think we'll touch on that a little bit today.
Great. And that might be a good transition point now.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for contributing to the chat. I still see them coming in, and they're so good, and we really appreciate, because it's important for Rachel and I to connect with everyone and kind of see where everybody is at, you know, today. And what we want to do is also acknowledge that we appreciate, you know, these challenges, that Rachel and I are both feeling them as well in our day-to-day activities as a nurse educator. And we just also want to sort of normalize that, given this unprecedented time, that we are all kind of shifting and moving and trying to really help our students get to their desired outcomes. It takes a lot of agility.
I agree. It takes a lot of agility. And you know what I keep coming back to in the midst of the pivoting and the agility, and what I like to think about is choppy waters, that ultimately good teaching is good teaching. And so I think it's easy to get caught up in becoming reactive and kind of getting stuck inside the box, versus as educators really trying to step outside the box and think about what are the ways in which we can embrace improving outcomes within the light of neuroscience and brain science evidence-based strategies. And something that you shared with me, Michelle, that I will share here that really resonated with me is I love how you challenge conversation with your colleagues on the committee, curriculum committee, around, are we doing this because of a pandemic, or are we doing this because it's the right thing to do and it's good teaching? And so whether the waters are calm on a good day without a pandemic, right? We still have some waves in academia, no matter what, if it's a good day without a pandemic, or if the waters are choppy and there's a lot of white caps out there, like we find ourselves now in the midst of a pandemic, it's really important to find a way to sort of get outside that box, remember and center and anchor ourselves on what really good teaching is. We need that anchor.
And you know what, Rachel and I, again, in putting our heads together, really thought about, we created a model to help serve as the anchor in these choppy waters, to help us navigate.
Yes, and the big reveal. So this model, we title it the GEARS model. And really what it stands for is grounding educators in academic rigor and safety. And the point of this was to really think about what are the things we need to think about as educators to keep in the forefront of our minds so that we don't get distracted with, you know, the waves coming at us. It helps anchor us. What are the relationships between those things we really need to consider, and not losing sight of what drives all of this, how the larger programmatic outcomes thread into our course outcomes, down into our class level outcomes, and then drive everything else.
Yeah, and I think if we, you know, going from top to bottom, at the very top was very intentionally placed as is really our curriculum map, our program outcomes, course outcomes, and class outcomes. And as you can see, this, you know, I think the whole model really is an anchor, but the top part really is sort of the start of that anchor, because these outcomes filter down and then impact the rest of these ever moving and shifting gears.
And you know, Michelle, when we talked about this and we thought about this, we talked a lot about how these gears are constantly shifting on a good day or, you know, a choppy water day, and how much these gear shifts are felt by our learners, even the slightest of these shifts. And so how do we approach this in a way that we can help build resilient students in the midst of all of this? So I'm thinking that we could begin with the end in mind, to quote Stephen Covey, right? And
Yes.
Start with the learning outcomes. And so I think it's really important as educators that we know the curriculum map in which we're operating at our program, because those larger program outcomes, like this funnel, are going to inform our course level outcomes and then drive the class outcomes we have for each class meeting, whether that's face-to-face, whether that's online, it's a hybrid model, whatever that may be. And so understanding where we sit within that larger framework is really important.
And you know what, Rachel, I also think that, you know, if we don't know where we sit, and when I say we, I mean like in our course. So if we are a teacher and a coordinator in one course, if we don't know where our course sits in that bigger map, I think we run the risk of getting what we talk about all the time is content creep. So we can start to worry as teachers that our students are not getting the content that they need, and or that they're not retaining it from earlier semesters, or that it's really important and it's something kind of on our radar and it needs to be put into the curriculum. But if we don't keep, you know, kind of our sights on how our course is connected to all the others and onto the outcomes, then what I think happens is our curriculum gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Exactly. I mean, it keeps coming back to these outcomes drive all of our decisions downstream, which in this model drives some of these gears, right?
Yes, and the moving pieces, I think we can all relate to this lately. As educators, we are managing all the moving pieces. So how this works is that we've got three components. We have the content we teach, the evidence-based strategies that are informed by, in part and largely by neuroscience, principles and concepts. And then we've got the environment and the context in which we teach. And as you can see, they're all very much connected, and they move on their own, and they also can help to move each other.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important piece, is how these are so interrelated. So slight shifts in one can really have impacts on the other, that as educators, we need to be cognizant of and really think about and consider in our decisions.
Yeah, so I'm thinking we can unpack these gears one at a time.
Yeah, that sounds good. So we'll start with content.
All right, so Rachel, so I'd like you, if you can, start with describing the content gear, and specifically, so I have a question. So what do educators need to think about when considering the substance of what we teach?
Oh, that is such a good question, Michelle. So it is so much more than just the breadth and the depth and the scope of the content that we teach, which is clearly informed by our outcomes, right? But it's also, how do we sequence it? How do we scaffold it across the time that we have with our learners, whether it be a 7-week semester, a 15-week semester, and across a larger program? And it's also about, how do we take these chunks, these pieces of information, and connect them together into a larger whole so that the learner can see the big picture. It's about bringing relevance. You know, also embedded in this gear that we don't make explicit, but I'll make explicit now, is also formative assessment and summative evaluation considerations to see if they're mastering content, right? So it comes back to KSAs.
And you know, when I think of KSAs, I'm thinking about knowledge, the skills, the attitudes that students need to achieve in order to reach their outcomes. So that's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it is a lot to think about. And especially when you go back to the interrelationship between these gears, and that the content can really shift on the evidence-based strategies and neuroscience gear, because not all content is conducive to all types of delivery strategies or teaching strategies. So if we took a closer look at this evidence-based neuroscience wheel, what are we really talking about when we talk about neuroscience? Also sometimes called brain science in the literature. And so when we talk about brain science strategies, we're really talking about leveraging how the brain stores, retrieves, and applies knowledge in different contexts, in different times, at the right time, at the right context, and for the right reasons. Because if you've spent more than a day in academia, you know that learners get to the right answer for the wrong reasons. They get lucky. And so we really need to be leveraging some of these evidence-based brain strategies to hone in on teaching thinking.
You know, I love this, Rachel. And I think it brings an important point that we are all nurses first. As nurse educators, we are nurses first. And so when we teach, we are continually focused on trying to help bridge the gap between what we're teaching students in the classroom and what students are going to be needing in the practice setting when they're taking care of patients, and what do they need to do that safely and accurately. So, you know, I think this idea of really helping students be able to take what they're learning and to put it into action, I think is pretty critical.
Yeah, and you know, ultimately what we're after is really helping to build enduring learning, reflective clinicians that have really strong metacognitive skills, right?
Yes, I love metacognition. Thinking about thinking is actually one of my favorite things to do.
I know it is. It's great.
I know. So I'm hearing you say, Rachel, that it's one thing to be able to store information, and it's another thing entirely to be able to access and use that information when it matters. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about what this looks like in your classroom, because I often hear, or it seems, and I hear it too, that students really want the content to be, you know, passively spoon-fed to them, or they just want to be told, like, what do I need to know?
Yes, I totally co-sign on that experience. I've had that many times over years teaching. And you know, this really goes back and speaks to one of the important tenets of my own teaching philosophy, which is moving this paradigm from this spoon-fed approach and expectation to setting the table for learning. And so it's important to help our learners understand that we can, as educators, our role is to set the table for learning, and they can come and participate in the meal. There's some heavy lifting on their part that's involved in that. And one way that we can help set the table for learning is the way in which we embed and integrate brain science strategies into our teaching approaches, both inside the classroom. And when we say classroom, I think it's important here to acknowledge not only just the physical space face-to-face, but also in our class settings, whether it be online, remote, whatever that may be. And so not only how we do that in those spaces of learning, but also how do we help our learners leverage brain science techniques on their own outside the classroom when they're studying and being immersed in the material in preparation for our time together. So what materials are we curating as educators or sending them to that can help embrace these brain science strategies?
That's great, Rachel. And, you know, I'm thinking that there are a lot of different strategies out there. And in fact, it can even be overwhelming. I know I have felt that way as a teacher before, like, where do I start? And I think there's some that we can focus on today. And there's three in particular that I think we can unpack is desirable difficulty, retrieval practice, and interleaving. And I just want to remind everyone before we dive into this that, you know, back to that ocean analogy, that this is just a drop in the pond. So we just hope to define a few terms and provide some examples.
Yeah, there's a lot out there, and we have a lot of resources for you that you can go and explore that more outside the context of this webinar. I think it's a great place to get started with desirable difficulty, and I'm thinking that probably not a lot of people, or there may be some that don't know really what desirable difficulty is. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about it and how you bring that to life in your teaching.
Sure. So desirable difficulty is a concept that really describes the struggle that students experience when learning, you know, in the learning process and when learning new information. And it's really this idea of how we can make information better retained so we can use it at a later time. And conversely, I want to make it clear that the less students really struggle and grapple with information, the less it's retained and the less they're able to use it at a time when they need to. And it comes back to the idea of, as an educator, that's really what we're aiming to do, is to help students retrieve information. So if without desirable difficulty in creating that struggle, the information can be fleeting. And we've all seen that in the classroom.
Yeah. It's really about that productive struggle. I love that imagery that kind of brings up when you think about that productive struggle. And it could take a lot of different forms, right? So one that comes to mind that I use in my practice is having small groups work together on a case study, a concept map, whatever that may be, without having their laptops out, without having their notes out, without going to the apps on their phone, really wrestling with the knowledge that they have, the material, before they short circuit their learning and go look something up and it's sort of easily fed to them. And I'm not saying that resources are not good. We definitely want our learners to know what resources are out there and how to use them in the moment. That's important. But as part of the learning process, that productive struggle and that wrestling before it gets short circuited is really important in being able to embed this in long-term memory for them to use later.
Yeah, and you know, Rachel, I think it can be difficult for our learners to accept this notion, because I think learners think learning, you know, that they should be able to get it. It should be easy. If they read their assignment and they think they understand it, it should be easy. And when it doesn't, and students find themselves not able to really apply the information, I think it can feel like a sense of failure. So I think it's, again, about reminding students that the struggle is part of the learning process. And, you know, here's an example. A lot of times when I'm working with students and they come after an exam, I might hear a student say, you know, I did all the readings and I read through the PowerPoint, I came to class and I still did poorly on the exam.
Yeah, I hear that too. And you know what that speaks to, the literature tells us, is this illusion of fluency. And that's really defined as, because something feels easy and good in the moment, that it will always feel that way at a later time. And that's not true. So as they're going through what they consider studying, which is really just this passive rereading, it is on a brain science level, just cycling through their short-term memory. It's never getting embedded in their long-term memory. So they feel good when they're doing it, and then they sit down for the exam and they feel like a ball is coming out of left field at them, thinking, I spent all this time on this and I don't know what this means and I don't know how to approach it. And so the way that fluency illusion can take form in the way that they study are things like highlighting every single word in their text other than the words of, than, it, or, right? It's like painted in highlighter. Or printing out the outline of a PowerPoint and not doing any thinking and creating an outline themselves. Using flashcards that were produced and given to them, right? So flashcards absolutely have a place, but when they get them passively, it really takes out the learning of creating those flashcards, and then getting study guides that are already created for them. So those are some of the things that reinforce this illusion of fluency. It's like salt in the wound for the learner because it feels good. They think they're doing the right thing, but it's really reinforcing this short-term cycle without long-term retention.
Yeah, and I think it's important to create this sense of desirable difficulty for students in the classroom. And I also try to encourage students to create desirable difficulty for themselves when they are studying. And I'd like to give an example of one thing that I've encouraged students to do is when they're studying, there's some real benefit to studying in pairs or small groups where students can really grapple and struggle with the difficult concept. So one thing I might do is encourage students to use a concept map and give them a template to work through. And what they can do is put this concept map up on a whiteboard, let's say, and then the two students will then work to input the information in the different components of this concept map. And the real magic in this is that students are doing two things. Students are not looking into their resources to get the information. They're doing it from their retained information, from their memory, from what they read, their PowerPoints, their class activities. So they're pulling the information out, putting it onto the concept map. The second magical piece is that students are really working together, they're dialoguing and they're having a conversation to get this information together collaboratively into the concept map. And then what ends up happening is that the students may then realize that they have a gap, a knowledge gap, something that they, at the point where they just can't, they don't have the information, then they together can go into their resources, pull it out, put it onto the concept map, make those challenging connections that they missed. And then what it does, and they can even do that in like a different color to really highlight an area of future focus while they're continuing their study.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful example. And I'm thinking back to our touch base, our pulse check with our listeners and how so many of them are really grappling with this interactive ability online. And when I hear you say this, I'm thinking of all of the technologies that can be used to replicate that experience in an online environment through Padlet or other interactive ways that we can recreate those experiences in the classroom online as well. So I really like that example because it really transcends different learning settings. What I also love about that is the dialogue, the learning through dialogue, which is really what we aspire to do to really enhance learning, that dual coding.
And Rachel, I'm wondering if you can share how else you've used desirable difficulty.
Yes, I will actually leverage desirable difficulty in the way that I structure content across class meetings. So I may not end a topic cleanly at the end of our class time together. And I may prime it up a little bit and drop some seeds that will percolate over the time that they're waiting between the next class and they're wrestling and working on synthesis and application and analysis activities on their own outside of class time. And when they come back the next time we reconvene, I'll pick up where we left off, and that reaching back to try to remember what we had already talked about and build on that to get traction really elicits that desirable difficulty, because the literature shows us, it's called learning to forget, that little bit of forgetting that happens and that struggle to retrieve it and get traction again actually cements and makes stronger connections and their retention and retrieval in future instances. And so that kind of sets us up for our next brain science strategy, Michelle, which is retrieval practice, right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about retrieval practice, we're really talking about opportunities for the learners to be able to reach back and recall information and knowledge. And this can take a lot of different shapes. We tend to think about it like quizzing and testing. It's called testing effect in the literature. But it can also be other opportunities where they have free recall opportunities. So case studies, small group activities, concept mapping. There's a lot of opportunities to create this retrieval practice and this free recall for our learners.
And Rachel, I'm hearing you say that retrieval practice can help to create a stronger ability to use information. And it reminds me of an analogy of maybe how a path is created in the woods, that the more foot traffic that happens over time, the clearer and the easier it is to navigate that path and really get to your destination.
Yes, and that reminds me of one of my favorite books on brain science is Benedict Carey's The Surprising Truth About How We Learn and Why It Happens. Uses that analogy beautifully about the more opportunities they reach back to retrieve, the more downtrodden that path is. Using memory changes memory, and it actually makes it stronger. So the more opportunities we give our learners, the better.
That's great. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more of the research that supports retrieval practice.
Yeah, so there's a lot out there on retrieval practice. You'll see it often called testing effect. And some of the leading thinkers on this, Henry Roediger, Jeffrey Karpik, some people call him Karpicki, but I've heard it more commonly Karpik. They've done some really interesting research. And just in a nutshell, to sum it up, one of the most interesting is one where they took a group of learners and they had them read a passage, a content of information, and then they continued to reread it, what our learners think of as studying, this passive rereading. They did it for a period of time before they were tested on their knowledge retention. And then they took another group of learners, had them read that same passage, that same chunk of content only once. And every other time that they interacted with that material was retrieval practice. It was free recall. And they did that for a comparable amount of time as the others were reading, right? So they had the same hands-on time with the material or thought time with the material. And then that group was tested the same way for retention. And the group that just read once and had multiple opportunities for free recall and retrieval practice, what I like to think of as being in relationship and engaged and immersed in the material, they far outperformed the group that just kept rereading all those times. And they far outperformed at the 1 week mark as well, which really speaks to the importance of retention and not cramming. We really are always trying to get away from this idea of cramming with our learners.
Yes, and so, I really appreciate the importance that teachers can create these opportunities to help learners forge these paths to more meaningful learning. And, I have another question for you. So is it important for retrieval practice to occur in real time in the classroom with teacher feedback?
Yes, and, right? Okay, so that's my response. Yes, and. So yes, we want to create these opportunities when we're either face-to-face with them in the classroom or synchronously or even asynchronously in our learning time together. Because like we mentioned before, learners get lucky, they get to the right answer for the wrong reasons, and we want to have an opportunity to teach thinking and help our learners learn how to learn. And so having that feedback right then can help reinforce the good thinking, but also buff up the faulty thinking. My and part of that is we also need to be actively thinking about how do we create these opportunities or encourage our learners to create these opportunities for themselves of retrieval practice outside the classroom and change their paradigm of studying, which to them is really this passive receipt of rereading and going over things, to really active retrieval recall practice.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the example that I gave about the concept mapping, that not only did that create this level of desirable difficulty where students, have to really struggle with trying to remember and recall information, but the act of, doing that retrieval practice, bringing it forward, I think can really be helpful for students to do, I think, better studying.
Yeah, and again, it's that active dialogue. Yeah. It's that dialogue, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that really leads us into our third brain science technique we wanted to talk about, which was interleaving, right?
Yes.
So when we think about interleaving, we're really talking about, and what the literature tells us, is interleaving is mixing similar but different concepts and intentionally and deliberately making connections between them in terms of similarities and differences. So words like compare and contrast, nuanced differences, discriminating between the two. So to put it in context and make it less abstract, one educator might talk about diabetes, right? And say, okay, class, we're going to talk about type 1 diabetes, and we're going to go through clinical manifestations and priorities of care and complications and expected outcomes, period. Okay, we're going to move on. Now we're talking about type 2 diabetes. That is blocking. That is the opposite of interleaving. And so if we were to interleave, we might approach our class and say, okay, so we're going to talk about insulin dysregulation. We got a lot of stuff on the board here. Type 1, type 2, gestational diabetes. let's think about how are they similar and how are they different across their clinical manifestations. Let's really highlight the nuances. And what interleaving does is it will leverage the brain's wiring to pick up incongruencies, and it will help them pick up nuances and see how things are uniquely their own and related. It helps with big picture thinking too.
Exactly. And, you know, I do something very similar in the classroom, and I'll give just another example. So if I were to teach, say, respiratory content, traditionally, I would have done more of a medical model, going through systems and going through like a topic outline of diseases. So for example, maybe COPD, asthma, and pulmonary embolism. And what I have started doing since I've started interleaving is really pull out some of those concepts, like say ventilation, oxygenation, and then talk about what does ventilation look like in COPD, asthma, pulmonary embolism? What does oxygenation look like in COPD, asthma, PE? And then what that really does is that magic word again is, or that phrase, it's really compare and contrast. And so I think that really helps students see the differences and the nuances, as Rachel said. And the other thing I think of is that as nurses, when we are taking care of patients in the hospital, we are essentially interleaving all the time. So we don't just take care of a COPD patient with a COPD problem. We're really dealing with their ventilation, with their oxygenation, and they also may have underlying asthma and maybe an acute pneumonia and bronchitis on top of that. So really, we are interleaving in practice. So I think the more we present the information using this kind of strategy, then we can really start to bridge that gap a little bit between classroom and clinical.
Yeah, and the examples we gave were within a class or a course. I also think that it can be used across courses and across a curriculum. What's your thinking of that?
Actually, yeah. So I think of something like, say, a skill, like a sterile dressing change. We may cover sterile dressing change with our students at the beginning of the program, maybe with adults in an acute care setting. And then later in a program, we're going to really ask students to take that same skill, sterile dressing change, and do it now in a community setting, say in somebody's home. And this is a beautiful opportunity for teachers to use interleaving to have a conversation, a dialogue with our learners about, well, what does this same dressing change look like in the acute care setting versus the home care setting? How are they the same? How are they different? And you know, I also was thinking, Rachel, that you talked about how you like to use cliffhangers at the end of your classes. And I'm thinking we're sort of doing the same thing with this webinar. Because there's really, again, I want to come back to that analogy. It's just a drop in the pond. There's really so much more we could talk about, but I think we have to move on to our next gear and start unpacking environment.
I totally agree. And we can refer everyone to that list of resources so that they can jump off that cliff into the next part. All right, so when we talk about this gear of environment, this is a big one to wrap our mind around because it encompasses the context, the milieu. It's so much more than just the environment in which we teach, the physical environment. So not only could it be the face-to-face classroom or the synchronous or asynchronous hybrid blended models, but it also involves the landscape of academia. So like now, we're in the midst of a pandemic, and there's a lot of shifting in that landscape now, lots of choppy waters, that I like to say, waves coming at us that are different sizes. But there's also things like campus and institutional level initiatives. I also think in this gear of things like learner characteristics. Think about the generation of learners. As educators, man, we need to be prepared when the K through 12 students now come up to us in higher education. That is really going to shift this gear a lot and impact the relationship of the other gears, our teaching strategies and our content scaffolding.
And, you know, when I think about our teaching environment now, I can't think about it without thinking about technology. And I'm starting to think that teachers, I think we might need technology KSAs of our own. We talk about KSAs for students, but I think we might need knowledge, skills, and attitudes around technology since it's such a central part of our teaching now. And, you know, to come back to another example, a few semesters ago, if I were to use, say, concept mapping as a teaching strategy in my classroom, I would have to think about the physical space and does it have maybe a whiteboard that I could display the map? And now I have to think about, well, if I'm doing online teaching, does my web streaming platform have a whiteboard application? And do I have the skill, right, and the knowledge to be able to use it? And then I have to think, well, what if maybe the whiteboard application may not have good visibility for the learners? So then that may drive me to start thinking about other options, like maybe are there web-based concept mapping applications that I can use that really have better interactivity? Or I may need to think, I might need to change my teaching strategy altogether. So I really think it's just challenging and really kind of empowering to think about what strategy we're using in the context and in the environment in which we're teaching.
Yeah, there is a lot of risk versus benefit analysis in this, I would say.
Yes. And so when I think about risk, I start thinking about the word, one of my favorite topics to talk about, which is vulnerability. And I think there's a lot of vulnerability in learning, and as teachers, where that vulnerability comes in calculating this risk.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that, because I think this brings us back to our larger model. We've done this 30-mile unpacking of the different components, but the one thing that we really haven't focused on is this circle, this container in which all of this occurs, which is very symbolic of psychological safety, the safe container in which our teaching learning interactions are going to happen, right?
Yes.
And so when we think about that, we kind of envision this model, this picture really encapsulating the essence of psychological safety, which is the space where learners are willing to take risks in the service of learning. And so, Michelle, we have taught together a lot, and something that I love hearing you say when we work together is that, the container is a place where students are willing to take risks. And I'm thinking, risk taking is not always an easy thing to do. So can you share with me a little bit more about what that means to you?
Yeah, so I think that risk-taking really brings up this idea of vulnerability. And I think Brene Brown does a beautiful job of defining vulnerability very simply. And she defines it as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And to me, I think students feel uncertain and have a lot of different emotions while they're in this high-pressured, high-stakes profession that they're entering into. And I think they're taking a lot of risks when, they're trying to ask a question in class, maybe performing a skill, passing a test. And so I really want to think of our role as educators to really normalize this phenomenon for students and really remind them that this is a vulnerable thing, that learning is hard, and help students, invite students to trust the process. And the other thing is that I think as teachers, we have a responsibility to make this very explicit. And when I say this, I mean this idea, this phenomenon of vulnerability, that it is uncomfortable. And we want to really invite our students again to kind of lean into that discomfort. And there's one thing that Rachel and I always say, which is, we invite students to be comfortable being uncomfortable in the service of learning.
Absolutely. And so much of this, we could do all of this model so great, right? Think about our learning outcomes driving all of these gears. But if we don't attend to the psychological safety, the wheels and gears literally come off the track, don't they?
Yes, absolutely.
So one thing that I also want to refer folks to that I think is helpful is Amy Edmondson's work in psychological safety and team learning, because it's really about creating this container where learners are willing to engage in learning-oriented behaviors for the service of learning, and risk-taking. It's vulnerable.
Absolutely. And I think just in general, I think it's really critical to make sure that we implement, when we're implementing best practice, that we embrace this vulnerability and create a psychologically safe environment in any environment, in any circumstance, at any time, and for the outcomes that we have set forth.
Yeah, and it's shifting that needle from the gotcha moments, like the waiting for the shoe to drop, catch ya moments, to this image of I got ya. And so it is absolutely possible to create a challenging learning experience that holds the bar high for excellence. At the same time, it happens in the context where learners feel supported and scaffolded for success. And so, Michelle, I'm cognizant of our time because I really want us to get to answering some of the questions in the chat box. So I'm thinking really briefly we could share contextually what psychological safety might look like coming to life for us.
Yeah, just very quickly, I take a lot of time explicitly at the beginning of a course to invite students to try to create this environment for learning and risk-taking together. So historically, where as a teacher, I may have, just gone through the syllabus, told everybody about the expectations and the rubric and the evaluations and moved on into content, like big, heavy content. Now I just take the time to really invite students to share with me on their end, what do they need to help them really take these risks and to really create accessibility in our classroom.
Yeah, and so much of this is about being authentic to ourselves as educators and having our own voice and how we bring this to life. For me, I'll share a little bit about my teaching philosophy with my learners so they understand how I view my role in the teaching-learning relationship and what their role is, what I have asked of myself and what I ask of them, really trying to create a culture of thinking, a culture where we embrace a growth mindset. And briefly, I think it's important to talk about how we hold a container, right? So it's one thing to set it, we actually have to walk our talk and hold it. And for me, holding the container is really about that intuitive, first it's walking the talk, and second, it's that intuitive feeling when you feel like the integrity of the container's in jeopardy, naming it and addressing it. Being transparent in our pedagogical decisions that we make in the course, not as a means of justification, but to help learners understand why things are set up the way they are to help build success for them. And it really goes a long way in creating buy-in for them.
Absolutely.
So I think with this, it's probably a great time to just recenter us on that bigger picture and then kick it out to participants. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. So I just want to bring it back to our model, which is that we've got the outcomes coming down that inform all of the decisions we make as educators. And those decisions are really centered on what content we teach, the evidence out there, and then the environment in which we're teaching. And these gears change and shift continuously. And then really, as educators, that we can help our students come along with us on this experience of shifting and changing and moving to meet the outcomes if we don't create this safe container and really invite our students to create it with us and to really help our learners shift and change with us. I think that's just the best way to say it, to move.
I love it.
Yeah.
So Beth, we want to invite you into this and help let us know some of the themes that you've been seeing and questions that are popped up on the chat box.
Great, thanks. This is wonderful. Y'all did a great job. One question that came up was, how can you differentiate neuroscience strategies from a curriculum framework? One participant was trying to compare interleaving like a concept-based curriculum, but can you help differentiate that and give some more context to that for us?
Yeah, so, the curricular framework gives you your structure, right? But evidence-based neuroscience strategies are the ways in which you help become a facilitator of learning and deliver content and engage in content and help reach your learning outcomes that your framework is really setting up for you. And I want to kick it to Michelle and see what your thoughts are on that.
No, I was thinking the same thing. I always think of this camera where you can zoom in and zoom out. So you can zoom into a strategy or you can zoom out to how your entire curriculum is created and designed, or within your course, how your course is designed. You can create a course to be delivered and designed differently in your curriculum as long as it has the curriculum components and you're meeting the outcomes.
Sue, did you have a question?
I did actually, and this kind of went back to the beginning, which is one that, I know the three of us have tackled before, and this is this notion of teaching. Good teaching is about transparency with your learners so that there are no gotchas. Teaching is not a gotcha. But in the same token then comes the transparency with expectations. So for instance, the 500 pages we assign learners to read, you know, we give them, what, 3 days? I'm just exaggerating. Sometimes there are that many pages. So can you speak to how does that weigh into success with these strategies? Because there is a lot of cognitive lift on the part of a learner with using brain science to back you up.
I totally, yeah, I totally agree. I think that is a great question. I would say, you know, this speaks to how learners really don't know the best way to learn. They don't really understand how their brain works. And so one of our roles as educators is really to consider what is our role in helping them learn how to learn. And so I do dedicate part of my time in helping support my learners in that. And that if X amount of pages, how do you engage with the textbook as a learning resource to support your learning rather than expecting it to feed you something? And so we spend some time, and I have curated learning resources in my course that help them learn how do you use the textbook and the information in it to prepare you for class, which is like high level, and this is what science shows, high level, looking at the pictures, looking at the headings, developing a concept level idea of where we're gonna go in our time together, any pre-work that they do need to do, come to class, and then in those muddy areas, those deep dive areas that are not making sense, that is the section they really need to dive in and use their textbook, you know, word for word and unpack, not unpacking all 500 pages before they come to class. So learning how to use their resources is important.
Absolutely. I agree. I have nothing else to add because it's that, again, that camera thing, you know, diving, kind of looking at the surface, getting the big picture and diving deeper if and when you need to. And then sometimes students will say, well, how do I know I need to? And that's when I say, well, that's when you do this formative quizzing. And, you know, we use apps like Socrative or Poll Everywhere. And if you're testing yourself as a way of learning, then you can understand and uncover those differences and those learning gaps, or doing those concept maps together. There's a lot of different ways to know if you need to go deeper.
I know we've just got just another minute, but Rachel, I know you said something about a cliffhanger. Could you give a quick example of what a cliffhanger was?
Yes. So in a foundations course, it might be that we have a class meeting and we go over content, and then maybe I dedicate the last chunk of time together to start a new concept like oxygenation. I'll prime it up, we'll plant some seeds, I'll set it up for them. They'll have some dedicated synthesis and application activities to do on their own outside of class that percolates over that time that we're away from each other. When we come back for our class meeting, I'll pick up on oxygenation. It's causing them to reach back and really struggle to pick up the traction where they left off, and that's a cliffhanger, as opposed to, I am gonna only talk about oxygenation on this lecture time, and I get away from lecture, the word lecture. I think it has a very strong connotation. Class time. This class time, I talk about oxygenation, period. We're done, we move on to the next topic at the next class meeting. I try to spread them out over class meetings and create those cliffhangers.
Yeah, and I actually do the reverse too. So you have these cliffhangers, but then I also bring my students backwards.
Yes.
And do that retrieval practice, moving back and pulling it forward. I have to think of a new name. That's not a cliffhanger. I don't know what that is, but.
Like a series. It's like a series show, you know.
Yeah,
last episode.
Exactly. You always have that, you know, you revisit the previous episode at the beginning of the new season. You have to.
Yeah, that's great.
This has been great.
Shepherd's hook.
I think we're out of time. If I look at the time, Rachel and Michelle, thank you so much. Andrea, do you need to add anything at the end?
I do not, other than to let people know that when you do close your window for the webinar, it will direct you automatically to the NLN Coronavirus Resource Center, the Taking Aim at Good Teaching webinar page. And there you will find the registration links for the next 2 webinars. We have one coming up in October and one in November. So thank you. Beth, if you want to wrap it up from here.
I don't have anything else. Again, thank you, Rachel and Michelle. It's been great. Sue, would you like to add anything else?
Nope. Well, I will, obviously. So thanks, everybody. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in October. And thanks to my colleague, Beth, and our 2 presenters, Rachel and Michelle. Have a good weekend, everybody.